Well, wasn't the German Grand Prix spectacular? It was brilliant, wasn't it? It had a bit of a lull in the middle, but it definitely came alive when the rain came, and then of course Vettel crashing out, safety car. I mean, it had a bit of everything. Had all those ingredients that you need to spice up a race and make it spectacular. It did raise some questions about, you know, if you look back over the season at the very best races, they're always the ones that have had a little bit of external influence from something like a safety car or something like that. So we still need perhaps to think in longer Formula One terms about how we make racing better without any of those additions, or do we make it that those additions happen every race somehow? Do we make sure that they do come in with some kind of artificial means? I don't know, but those are discussions that are going on. But anyway, the German Grand Prix yesterday I thought was great, and today, of course, being Monday, means it's Q&A Monday. Today, I've got a couple of little helpers to help me with it. You guys, as ever, have sent in loads of questions, so let's get into it. But first, say roll the sting.
Roll the sting!
Roll the sting. Right, let's get into it. Rex, got the first question.
Jonathan Littlemore says, after watching Lewis Hamilton ride his soft tyres for most of the race, do drivers or engineers have any way of knowing if the tyres are going other than just looking at them or feel of the car?
Excellent reading of the question. So the question there, do the drivers and teams have any way of understanding when the tyres are about to either wear out or go off, I think is what Jonathan's saying. And well, look, they have a couple of things they can use. Obviously, on board the car, they have sensors that measure tyre pressures, they measure tyre temperatures. So they have that information all the way around every single lap, all the way throughout the race. When it comes to knowing if they are going to go off or whether they're going to wear away or anything like that, there is no sensor that specifically gives that information. So they have to rely on things like the data they've collected on Friday and specifically the driver's feel for what he's feeling inside the cockpit of the car. So the running that the teams do on Friday is mostly about understanding the tyre life of each of the different compounds at different fuel loads and things like that. So the running that particularly they will do in FP2 on Friday is all about, or lots of it is about putting high level fuel loads in the car, running a particular compound for long stints over the course of that practice session. And of course what they get, which they don't get in the race, at the end of the practice session, is they get to take the tyres off, have a good look at them, analyse them, look at the lap times, look at all the data that have been collected over that stint, talk to the driver, get his feedback as well, so that when it comes to the race, they can take that learning and understanding that they've had from Friday, compare it to hopefully comparable conditions, and start to get a picture of what they think will happen if they were to just keep running that tyre over and over for the race, knowing when they think it will start to drop away in terms of performance, knowing when they think they might start to get blistering or whether wear will become the biggest issue. All of that sort of stuff is the kind of things that they are building up, this data-led picture throughout Friday to then take them into the race. But ultimately, the driver's feedback is the one that gives them the most real-time, up-to-date information of how the tyres are performing on the car at that particular moment in those conditions when it comes to race time. So that's one of the things they have to rely on most on a Sunday afternoon.
As on F1 says, does the fact that Marc only signed a 1 year plus 1 year option contract with Bottas mean they think he's not good enough and ultimately will be Lewis Waterboy? Why else didn't they just give him the same duration?
Right, Raz on F1. Why did they give Bottas just a 1 year contract when they gave Lewis a 2 year contract? Well, there's a number of reasons. First of all, I don't think he's there to be Lewis's water boy at all. I don't think that's why they've signed him. I think they've done it because they believe Valtteri Bottas is good for the team. He's actually a great driver. He can deliver race wins. He can definitely deliver the podiums when Lewis brings home a race win. And he will bring them home massive points for the team that will help them win the Constructors' Championship. That's why they have signed him. Why have they done it on a one-year contract? Well, look, yes, they don't think he's as good as Lewis. I don't think many people think he or anyone else on the grid is as good as Lewis. There are very few people in the same category as Lewis Hamilton. I think that's fair to say. The other point that a team has to think about is when their driver contracts are coming to an end. So if they sign up drivers and have both drivers coming to the end of their contract at the same time, so at the end of the same season, potentially that can be an issue for them, because if both drivers suddenly decide they're going to walk away, they've got no continuity. They've got to find two new drivers at the top of their game to lead that team. And that's a much bigger challenge than finding one to come into the first or the second seat whilst you remain or retain some continuity in the other side of the garage. So that's always preferable for a team. The other thing, of course, is they are definitely keeping their options open. If they don't think Valtteri Bottas is, you know, a tier A driver, perhaps in the class of Lewis Hamilton, well, you know, I wonder if they think there may be other options available at the end of next year. Don't forget, teams like Mercedes have a driver program. So they've got people like Esteban Ocon on the books. They've got George Russell on the books at Mercedes. So they've got a feeder program for their drivers that they may well look to fall back on at some point. And you never know, if Valtteri Bottas's form starts to disappear next year and Esteban Ocon really steps his game up, or George Russell even, you know, there could be other options that Mercedes could look at. So that's why they've done it. They're keeping their options open, and they're also looking at when the driver contracts expire for the future.
Kenny McFadden says, I saw some Ferrari mechanics around the back of Vettel's car on the grid pre-race wearing jackets with padding sewn in the back. What's the purpose of those?
Another excellent question, and well read by Ginger. Those jackets, I tried to find a picture online but I couldn't. The purpose of those jackets, or those suits that those particular people, and it's only a few mechanics, the reason is that the guys who do the refuelling in the garage have to, within the regulations, wear a full fireproof suit. Now, of course, we all used to have to wear those back in the day when we were doing refueling during the race. We had to wear the full Nomex underwear, Nomex fire suits, balaclavas, the whole lot. Nowadays, of course, we don't do refueling live in the race, but they are still putting fuel into the cars, of course, in the garage. And if you remember back to the big fire that Williams had, the garage fire back in Barcelona, off the back of that, a number of rules were changed about where fuel's stored in the garages, how it's stored and how it's used. And one of those changes was that at all times, the guy or guys or girls inside the garage who are putting fuel into the cars at any time must always be wearing this suit that is full Nomex fireproof suit at all times. So when you see the guys on the grid, that is the reason, because they've just left the garage having been putting fuel into the cars, and therefore they're wearing those suits. They look padded, it's just they're a bit bulkier and a bit bigger than the normal suits that everybody else is using, but that's the reason.
Stuart Shaw says, what did you make of Ferrari fitting dry ice on the airbox camera pre-race?
Very good. Well, Stuart, I didn't actually see that. I must admit, I didn't see that on the TV. However, I'm going to make a big assumption here, because this is something that's happened for years, in that, oh God, wet dogs. They've just got out the river, and every time they run past us, we all get soaking wet. Anyway, sorry, Stuart. What happens is that airbox camera, which is probably where you saw the shot from, I would imagine, of course, is on top of the airbox. They do put dry ice fans into the airbox to cool the top of the engine, the intake of the engine, pre-race. So on the grid, they will definitely be doing that. There's a big fan that slots in the top of the airbox. Of course, that's right in front of that camera that you would have probably been looking at. And in there they put dry ice, they blow the air over the dry ice, which means it lowers the temperature, and of course that goes straight into the charge ports of the engine and just lowers the whole temperature before the race gets underway. So I imagine that that's what it was. I don't think it was actually anything to do with the camera. It's just that the camera is mounted on the airbox intake, and that is what they were trying to cool down. Peter Wright says, hi Mark, I'm a hydraulics engineer and I've noticed that it appears that the most unreliable system on an F1 car is the hydraulic system. Hydraulic system is normally very reliable, so what is different on an F1 car? Well, everything's different on an F1 car, isn't it? I mean, that's the thing. Formula One is pushing every single system on the car to its absolute limits, whether it's a sort of a structural carbon fibre piece or an electronic system or a hydraulic system, pneumatic system. Everything's being pushed to the limits because that's what Formula One is. It's pushing the boundaries of all this technology, taking it to its absolute limit, trying not to step over that limit, but making sure you're operating at the limit for the absolute best performance. So the first thing I would say is that I actually don't think that the most unreliable system on an F1 car is the hydraulic system. I know that there have been a couple of failures, specifically on the Marc in recent races, and they've come, over the last few weeks. So that puts it in the forefront of your mind, particularly if you're a hydraulics engineer. I guess it would have jumped out at you as being a highlighted problem. I actually don't think that that's a common failure at all. I think it's something that perhaps could be a Merc-specific problem, or could be just completely coincidental. But the fact is that a Formula One hydraulic system, yes, it's as light as it can possibly be, it's as small as it can possibly be, it's operating at extreme pressures for that size and weight. The materials they use are obviously trying to be cutting edge, they're trying to maximise performance yet save weight in every single area. And of course the environment that it has to work in is pretty harsh, I guess. It's being bounced around a racetrack at incredible speeds, it's operating at incredible temperatures sometimes, running through parts of the car where perhaps the exhausts might be running at incredible temperatures. So there are lots of different extreme parts of the environment of a Formula One car that can create issues, but it is designed specifically for purpose. So it shouldn't be unreliable, and actually I don't think it normally is. I just think that we've had a couple of issues recently that have made that the kind of headline news story. So I don't think too much is very different, Peter. It depends on the type of hydraulics that you're working on. If you're working in industry, for example, I guess a hydraulic system is designed specifically to be reliable. That's what its main purpose is. With a Formula One car, yes, it has to be reliable, but it also has to be operating at the extreme levels of performance. So the design characteristics are probably quite different. Omar Zaman says, at one point during the German Grand Prix, we saw a broken piece from the front wing from one of the Ferraris, possibly Vettel's. Is it possible that it had something to do with Vettel losing grip and crashing out later in the race? Ginger, what do you think?
Nah.
Rex?
Nope.
Absolutely right. No, don't think it had anything to do with it at all. I think, unfortunately, in the conditions as they were when Vettel crashed out, it's a bit of a lottery. You have to be super careful. Vettel wasn't careful enough, and he paid a very heavy price. One thing that struck me actually about that was that I was quite surprised that he didn't immediately go for reverse. And I know he was kind of in the gravel and it was unlikely he would have got out, but he immediately kind of felt like he gave up and he was bashing the steering wheel and on the radio swearing and apologising to his team. My first reaction would have been, I need to see if I can get out of this. But he didn't go for reverse, he didn't try and sort of wiggle the steering, it just didn't seem to do anything apart from immediately go into this deep depression, which I understand, but surely your first instinct is to try anything you can to get out of that predicament. But there we go. So no, I don't think it was a lack of downforce. I think it was just a lack of grip on the wet track that he misjudged and unfortunately got it horribly wrong. Anjo says, hey Elvis, according to Sky, Sauber are going to focus on developing next year's car for the rest of this season. When do teams usually start developing for next year? I assume it's different for the big teams versus the smaller ones. Well, yes, it is different for big teams versus smaller ones. And in terms of when you say developing for next year, that's perhaps different to designing for next year, because the design process for next year's car started for all of the teams some time ago, quite a long time ago. The development process, I guess, is what you're referring to, is how much resource they put into developing the ideas that they've designed already, ahead of next year. And that is the biggest area that differentiates between the big teams and the small teams. The small teams, of course, just don't have the resource, the people, the time, the facilities to be able to constantly start testing new ideas, start putting new ideas through their wind tunnel or through CFD systems. They don't have the numbers of people in the drawing office to take off the fight for this year's championship, which they could well be in the midst of. The midfield battle, don't forget, is incredibly tight. They don't want to take their eye off that, because a couple of points either way could mean that they drop 2 or 3 positions in the constructors table, and that can, be the difference between huge financial gain for them at the end of the season. But they need to focus on next year's car, particularly this year or this time, because next year, of course, brings with it a big aerodynamic regulation change, which takes a lot of work, a lot of effort. So that's where the bigger teams have a big advantage, particularly during a regulation change, because they can start to divert some of their workforce, some of their resources onto the big project of next year's car much earlier than some of the smaller teams can.
Thank you for all your questions this week. And don't forget to like, share and subscribe.